Reservoir Dogs meets The Most Dangerous Game. We are talking Bring Him Back Dead. This one is directed by Mark Savage and stars one of my all-time favourite kind of B-movie action heroes in Gary Daniels. And here he stars alongside Louis Mandylor. Of course, he starred with Costas Mandylor previously in Fist of the North Star. And we've also got Daniel Baldwin in a small role as well. So what is the story, and what do I mean kind of by this kind of Reservoir Dogs kind of meets The Most Dangerous Game? So it's clearly influenced by the early works of Tarantino. When we had kind of Reservoir Dogs and Pulp Fiction kind of come out back then, there was a ton of straight-to-video kind of cool gangster type movies that kind of hit the market in the wake of those films. And this movie feels like it should have been kind of released back then. It kind of feels like one of that ilk, basically. It focuses on a crew of criminals who are, at the beginning of the movie, ripping off a jewellery store or some type of jewellery deposit. And they basically get away with a bunch of diamonds. But the heist doesn't go quite to plan. It ends up being quite bloody. And they're holed out in this kind of woodland hideout in the kind of, there's some type of rural area, waiting for a buyer to buy these kind of diamonds that can kind of all get paid. And there's a little bit of kind of mistrust amongst these group of criminals because they have different ideas about what should have happened, things like this. But one of the kind of this group, played by Gary Daniels, character called Alex, decides he's going to take these diamonds all for himself and essentially gets away with all of the whole stash, and it's up to this kind of group of criminals to try and hunt him down, most dangerous game style, and obviously retrieve the diamonds before the buyer turns up. What will happen? You have to watch the movie and find out. So let's discuss what I think works for this film. Now, this is a very low budget film, clearly. But one of the things it does that I think is probably the smart move, it doesn't try to overexert itself in its scale. This movie is quite a small scale movie, and it's clearly down to somewhat kind of budgetary restrictions, but in a way, if you can kind of get around budgetary restrictions, and it maybe isn't entirely successful with that, we'll come on to, but I think if you can write around that and have situations that don't involve, lots of extras, lots of kind of location shooting and things like that, you're better off rather than trying to kind of like, do these things that are more over ambitious, but maybe, you can't really do it with the budget that you have. So I think this movie is relatively smart in regards to that. And I do think it's an interesting kind of story in some ways that play to those kind of strengths. It's a small scale story. We have one guy who is played by Gary Daniels, who is kind of on the run, and we simply have these 4 criminals that are kind of chasing him. So it's not like tons, it's not like masses of kind of like, bodies and extras and things like that. So it's relatively kind of small scale and has that more of a kind of an intimate kind of feeling. And I actually kind of quite like the idea of kind of mishmashing these two kind of storylines, really, the kind of the Reservoir Dogs one and The Most Dangerous Game. It kind of does. I think it goes together quite well in a kind of a story, because it's, let's be honest with you, these are criminals. They're probably not upstanding people, so there's chances are there is going to be kind of double crossings and things like that. And then as the movie goes on, we learn kind of there may be even more on top of that as well. I think one of the decisions here was to have all of the cast are bad guys, basically. Now, there's varying degrees. We have, for example, Gary Daniels' character may be a little bit more altruistic. He doesn't really want to kind of get involved and be shooting innocent people. And, the movie has to kind of try and make him likable. So it tries to justify why he's kind of doing what he's doing. Which I don't think was necessary, if I'm completely honest, but we've got to have a reason to root for him. But the characters all have their own individual motivations and various kind of. We have one who's like a real psycho, who's easily kind of triggered, things like that. So the movie does kind of follow that kind of Reservoir Dogs formula, where it does kind of give you these kind of like these little kind of character moments within these kind of like this group of criminals. You know, we have this icy cold female assassin type who's just like 100% business, who kind of got this like this wild guy who's kind of very easily kind of angered and things like that, and it just kind of flies off the handle. We got like this one who's a bit more of a kind of a joker, for example, and is more of just like, doesn't really seem like he's in his element, things like that. So, you know, again, it's taken that formula from kind of Reservoir Dogs and kind of, you know, redoing it in this kind of B-movie kind of format. And, you know, it's, the action sequences are reasonably sparse, to be honest with you, but I think it makes more sense in context of the film. And, you know, Gary Daniels hasn't missed a beat. I think he's just as watchable as he has always been, obviously, despite his kind of advancing years now. And he still hasn't missed a beat either in his kind of like fight sequence. He can still pull off some very impressive kind of fight moves and is in kind of, you know, in great shape and things like that. Louis Mandylor, I think, was quite fun as this kind of like the head bad guy, I suppose, the head kind of criminal whose kind of plans are unraveling. Because he feels like, what I liked about him, he doesn't feel like his character is all his kind of ducks in a row. He does feel like he's kind of like panicking a little bit, and you know, he's having to kind of like make decisions on the fly. So it doesn't seem like he's a completely kind of competent kind of criminal mastermind. He's just doing the best he can. So we have these characters that are kind of quite kind of flawed and things like this, and we introduce some more character moments as the kind of the film sort of progresses. We come across a couple of kind of innocent bystanders, which I think the movie does a good job of actually kind of making you feel quite sorry for these kind of people, because they end up getting kind of mixed up in this all these kind of shenanigans and things like that. And you know, even though they have a small screen time, I think that was still quite an impactful kind of moment. Yeah, so overall the plot is quite interesting. I think it's quite an interesting kind of idea. It doesn't try to overexert itself. You know, we've got the eclectic band of kind of characters. I think they're all pretty kind of interesting. And it's relatively kind of violent at times. Let's talk about what doesn't work in this movie, at least in my opinion. The budget clearly shows in this film. To me, it feels like there wasn't a load of takes in this movie. And why I say that, there are certain sequences here that feel clunky and awkward. Particularly some of the fight sequences where I really don't feel the choreography was particularly kind of up to scratch on some of the fight sequences. It feels clunky. It doesn't feel like it's particularly kind of well kind of put together cinematically and things like that. There are also other sequences as well that just feel like they've only done like maybe one take and like we haven't got time kind of move on, that sort of thing. So the movie does have this kind of like cheapness to it that kind of feels like it's somewhat kind of been kind of slapped together. There are some silly moments in the movie that just don't make any sense really at all, and some are just like a little bit eye-rolling. For example, we have that sequence where, you know, Gary Daniels' character he throws like a lighter behind him and explodes his car. There's literally zero reason to do that. There's no reason to explode this car. There's not an in-story reason why he's having to destroy this car. It doesn't make any sense. It's just done to have this kind of like explosion. And I'll be honest with you, it's like a drop-in VFX explosion. They could have probably just done without that, if I'm completely honest. But there's things like this that are just in the movie that just seem to kind of not make a lot of sense. We have this sequence, for example, and I don't want to spoil anything, but we have a sequence where Gary Daniels is trying to defend himself against these other criminals, and he's got a rifle in one scene, and we have two different criminals that are coming on these kind of quad bikes, and instead of just like shooting one and, you know, getting it down to kind of maybe one criminal, he gives the gun to this kind of like this other character who's in the movie who misses. And it's just like, why would you do that? You know, you could have easily shot one, maybe even two of these kind of both these criminals, because they're driving right straight in front of you. But instead he gives the gun to someone else who can miss it, just because it kind of adds that tension. So there are some kind of very kind of cheesy kind of moment in the movie where, you know, you can see why the kind of the filmmakers say, yeah, that will just do that to kind of like, because we want this to happen, we want the kind of story to be extended. So the film feels like it's unnecessarily making dumb decisions as the movie kind of goes on. Some of the acting, I've got to be honest with you, is a little questionable. There are characters here that I won't point out the individuals, but where I didn't feel the acting was particularly kind of good. It's not everyone. I do think some of the actors here are absolutely fine. You know, they do a fine job here, but there are some alternatively that I think don't do the best job. We also have a character played by Daniel Baldwin, who is completely superfluous. I can only assume that Daniel Baldwin was kind of visited the set because one of his friends was there, and they said, "Oh, you know, we'll kind of write you into the movie. We do this sequence for you." Absolutely has no impact on the story whatsoever. Completely superfluous kind of character. Didn't need to be there. The movie is you know, it's okay, but it does feel derivative, as I say, or let's be kind and call it influenced by the movies that I've mentioned and maybe a few others. So it doesn't feel, although it's kind of a mishmash of kind of stories, which does make it, I've got to be honest with you, a little bit of an interesting idea. You can't help but feel it is derivative of, you know, a mishmash of other movies. That being said, I was still quite intrigued with the story. I kind of like the fact that you know, the story is completely about a group of criminals and with varying degrees of kind of morality and things like that. And I quite enjoyed the decision to have a more of a small scale kind of you know, action kind of movie, which I quite enjoy. I think it plays to its strengths, and it was an interesting idea, and I kind of quite like the characters. And I think because it doesn't have a huge cast, but at least we get to know some of the characters. We feel they do have a little bit of kind of personality. And I was even quite sad when one of the kind of the criminals actually gets killed, because he seemed like, until that point, like an okay guy. Anyway, for me, I gotta say, even though I do think this movie is quite heavily flawed, it still has a pretty good entertainment value, and I will give this one a 6 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.